Before we begin, a reminder. This podcast discusses mature themes that may not be appropriate for all audiences. Please listen with care.
So I remember having a conversation with my counselor. I remember it was a couple years down the road, and I was really sort of struggling still with all the things that I felt like I had left behind when I detransitioned. And so he said, well, what are the things that you loved about Sarah? That was the name that I went by at the time. What were the things that you loved about Sarah? Getting past the sort of more superficial things like clothing and makeup and whatnot.
Sean is a father and Catholic convert who for a time presented as a woman and went by the name Sarah.
And so I said, well, I loved the fact that I as Sarah, I could sit down with someone and just empathize with them. That I wasn't focused on myself. I was looking out at the other person and just loving them. And so we talked about the things that, like, as Sarah, I felt like I could more easily embrace or live out. And so he asked the question, like, what prevents you from being able to do that as you are now?
When I asked Sean to give a brief introduction of himself to you, this is what he said.
It feels overly pious, but it's what's coming up, so we'll just go with it. Okay. My name is Sean, and I've been loved into existence, and I wish more than anything to spend eternity with you.
Today, we will hear from Sean about his own experience, as well as from two experts on seeking personal integration in the merciful gaze of Christ. We've discussed in this series the division and fragmentation within the church and in society. And today, we'll be looking at the division and fragmentation within our very selves. What do we do with the parts of ourselves that don't seem to fit into our ideal self-image? Do we allow God's mercy to touch those parts of our lives? Or do we keep them in hiding, hoping they might fade away? These questions do not just apply to those experiencing gender discordance. They apply to each of us, to our own internal struggles. And the way we respond to the unexpected parts of our personalities that show up might be indicative of how we respond to someone who doesn't immediately fit our expectations. Do we respond with a severe dismissal, in the name of truth perhaps, but without the character of love? Or do we respond with wishy-washy acquiescence, in the name of love maybe, but without the fullness of truth? Or do we find refuge in the one who is love and truth incarnate? This is what Sean's story is all about. I'm Abigail Fulbali, and you're listening to the Gender Accompaniment Project. This is episode 5, Seen and Love.
My faith journey really, I would say it's really only about 10 to 12 years old at this point. Back in 2010, my son was born, and about a year after that, my ex and I separated, and then we got divorced. And that for me was a big stepping stone, I would say, into needing to explore my faith, because it sort of felt like everything had fallen apart at the time. And honestly, a big part of that was related to my gender, and that was something that came up over the next sort of few years. When I first started going to counseling with that, at first it was just focused on the divorce. But then after we had talked about that for a bit, and things were less crisis mode, then we started talking about the things that had led up to it with my gender. And with that, we started talking about, like, sort of needing to open up to people. I needed community. I needed belonging.
Having grown up in a nominally Episcopalian family, Sean returned to the faith during that time of crisis. He began attending an Episcopal church and got involved in a Christian catechetical program.
I would say that definitely, like, enlivened my faith in a lot of ways. So we're talking about the Old Testament. We're talking about Genesis. And we talk about that moment in Genesis when Adam and Eve are hiding behind the tree. And God comes along and he says, "Where are you?" And Adam says, "I was afraid, and so I hid." And I remember reading that because that was the very first time I'd ever read that. And it was certainly the first time I'd ever read it symbolically, and seeing that as like this very strong image of self-protection, self-preservation, hiding. And I realized, like, when you hide from other people around you, you inevitably also hide from God. It's just how it works.
This desire to come out of hiding inspired Sean to begin exploring aspects of his experience of gender that he had been afraid to face.
It was 2015 that my divorce was finalized. By that point, I had explored my gender to the point that I identified more with women. And so that was sort of a better fit for who I was as a person. And I didn't feel like I could do that without a medical transition that sort of went along with that. It was about that point that I started developing like really, really strong anxiety about presenting as male. I don't exactly know how to describe it, because of the fact that I felt as if I identified more as female. Then when I was presenting as male, it felt very fake. It felt very like, why don't people recognize this inner self that isn't exposed to the outside world? So I started on hormones. I was on hormones for a year and a half. So that was a testosterone blocker and estrogen and progesterone. And started like experiencing emotional effects from that, both just in terms of like hormonal, but also in terms of like, hey, my life is now moving again. I'll say sort of in retrospect, it wasn't moving in a good direction, but it was moving. And that in and of itself sort of like felt freeing. And it's a very interesting sort of thing because like I was coming to life in my spiritual life as well at that time. Like my relationship with God was growing at that time, which always sort of gives me some pause.
You said this gives me pause. Can you say more about what you mean by that and why?
So I know that I'm also not the only one who has experienced this, where there are people who have transitioned, and in transitioning, they find a spiritual awakening that sort of results in them drawing close, like having a deeper awareness of God's presence. And I think that throws me off for a bit, simply because if you simply look at the sort of moral facts, I guess I would say, then you would expect that a person in that situation would be sort of finding themselves further and further away from God, metaphorically speaking. You know, I was talking with a friend about this as I was coming into the church, and she suggested to me perhaps God had allowed me to transition so that he could bring me back.
One thing I've thought before too is that it seems like a lot of the desires that would make transition appealing are also similar desires that would make faith appealing, right? Like wanting this sense of like to become who you really are, to transform, to find belonging, to find wholeness and integration, right? It seems like you're like, in a way, you're like open in that experience in a way that maybe also opens you to God.
Well, that was something I was thinking about this morning when I was walking, when I was sort of mentally preparing for this, and walking a dog. I was thinking about, the fact that like our desires, even when we desire something that ultimately won't be good for us, like underlying that is something good, in a sense. Like, yeah, maybe it needs to get refined and purified and elevated, but I was thinking about, kind of like what you said, like there is something that a person is looking for here, and the answer isn't, hey, stop desiring that thing. It's like, bring it to God and let him show you what it is that you're missing. But yeah, so I started like sort of coming out to more people in my family, and that the entire next year, God sort of broke into my life, and the word Catholic started coming up a lot. And I attended a Catholic women's conference back in 2016, which was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed it. And it was the sort of situation where I reached out to the women who were running it and sort of informed them of my situation, that I was a divorced transgender Episcopalian wanting to come to a Catholic women's conference in Peoria, Illinois. And if they didn't want me to come, I would understand, because I didn't want to be chased out with sticks or anything like that. And they, to my surprise, basically responded, "This feels like a Holy Spirit moment. You should probably come." I really needed that in a lot of ways, because while I had been very interested in Catholicism, and one of the very fascinating things about the Episcopal Church is that it tries so hard to be Catholic, but it just doesn't want to officially embrace the teachings of Catholicism. Formally, anyways, they teach much of what the Catholic Church teaches. However, the problem is that they've looked at those teachings and said, well, people can't reach that bar, so we're not going to change the teachings, but we're going to lower the bar. We're not going to hold people to that standard. You know, I'm a parent, and I have a child, of course, and if I lower the bar, then he's going to go for the bar. If I raise the bar, he's going to go for the bar. The church as our mother, I just love the fact that the Catholic Church actually believes that highly in us. I mean, with God's grace, obviously. The church hopes that much in us that we can actually reach that bar. And I think that's one of the things that I find discouraging about the Episcopal Church, is the fact that they say, no, I don't think you can do it.
That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. It's almost like there's something, you're right, discouraging about that.
Yeah, well, you want your parents to believe in you. And I love the fact that the church says, hey, you can be a saint. Like, not just you can be a pretty good person, but you can be a saint. Yeah, so I really needed that conference in a lot of ways, because it opened up the door to the possibility of becoming Catholic, because I would have never considered it otherwise, because I just figured that, Catholics are judgmental and Pharisaical and like overly focused on the rules, and some Catholics are that's true. But setting that to the side, I remember I was waiting for my flight on the way home from that, and I had bought my first rosary while I was there, and like prayed a rosary before this beautiful statue of Our Lady and reached out to a friend of mine who was back home and said, like, talk me off this ledge. I feel like I'm going to end up becoming Catholic. And to which she responded, you do know that I'm Catholic, right? And I said, no, I did not know that, in fact.
Catholicism continued to pop up in Sean's life in other unexpected ways.
And then my son started going to Catholic school as well. That was my ex's idea. She's not baptized, but she's always sort of like loved the Catholic school tradition in a lot of ways. And so I switched parishes to be there. And that was when I found out about RCIA. That was also when I found out about Adoration, which, oh man, that was what got me ultimately, was just having this opportunity to kneel before Jesus and have this intimacy with him. Yeah, that was what did it ultimately, was knowing how excited he was when I came to visit him. Yeah, no, he's far more loving than I could ever be.
Adoration has become an unexpected recurring theme among the interviews we've done for this series, consistently emerging as a space for healing and wholeness through the encounter with Christ. I wanted to ask Sister Maria Gemma about this, who we met in episode 1, because she belongs to an order that practices perpetual adoration. I thought of one last question, because something I think that comes up in some of the first personal experiences that we've heard is the importance of adoration. Like, there seems to be something like really profoundly healing about that specifically. And I wonder if, since you come from an order and that's your charism, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how adoration itself might be like a ministry of the church in this particular area, or why that would be something that brings healing when it comes to struggles with gender.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. two different kind of thoughts. One thought is that Jesus in the Eucharist, in adoration, is so raw and vulnerable. He just puts himself there for us, and his bodily presence that we can gaze upon in the Eucharist, we can't leave his presence without being changed. I think part of what goes into that is that when we're in the presence of this vulnerable God who gives himself to us over and over again, we can't hide anymore. And so when we're locked in that gaze with him in Eucharistic adoration, we can't hide. And I think of Adam and Eve in the garden, right? They did this thing, they took the fruit, and their instinct is to hide. And God is looking for them. And in adoration, even the act of going into the adoration chapel, going to adoration, is stepping out from behind that bush and saying, "Here I am, Lord. You can see me, and I'm going to let you love me." And that's a process, and that's a journey to let the Lord's love soak into us and change us. But the importance of even just availing ourselves to adoration is a coming out of hiding. Opening ourselves to the gaze of the one who knows us, loves us, heals us, just the gaze of love.
So, when you look in the mirror and you see yourself, for me, when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone else. And so there was not a recognition when I looked in the mirror. And that was really, honestly, it was just really frightening. Because it was like, well, then who am I? Like, who is this person I'm looking at? This is not me. So for me, going to adoration was this really healing process of, so the image that Jesus gave me, was that when I walk in the door to adoration, his sacred heart burns hotter. It goes back to Song of Songs, right? Like, he's just totally in love with me, and he sees me as beautiful. That's the case whether I'm male or female or whatever you want to call it, is he sees me as beautiful. And so for a good long while, it was just like, well, I don't see it. I don't know what he's talking about, but he says that I'm beautiful, so I'm just going to live from that. And hopefully over time, that can help me remember to see myself that way.
During adoration, Sean, in a sense, was able to re-enter Eden. He no longer hid the parts of himself he couldn't stand and the parts of himself he was getting to know. In the loving, healing gaze of Christ in the Eucharist, Sean began to find a new way of living. So how did Sean begin to live out of that image that Jesus had given to him in adoration? How did this experience of coming out of hiding unfold in his life?
So I started attending RCIA and ended up having conversations with a couple different priests. The first priest who I talked to, he did a fantastic job with it because I was still transitioning at the time, but I was wrestling with questions of how do I do this? Can I do this within the Catholic Church? Maybe I can get them to fix their teachings on this, because I was still in that mindset where I knew better than the church. I remember it was after a 6 p.m. mass on a weekday, and he sort of pulled me to the side and said, "Hey, I know that you emailed me and said you wanted to have a conversation. You want to have a conversation right now?" So we went up to his office and we sat down, and he started out by just saying, I can see that you love our Lord. I can see that you have this beautiful faith, and the fact that you are asking these questions about your identity, about who you are, about your purpose, about meaning, these are the right questions to be asking. Most people don't explore their lives. So, tell me your story. Tell me who you are. I feel like I have a lot to learn from you too. And so we just talked for an hour. Well, I talked for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he said, "Let's meet again next week." So I met him again next week. And I remember being struck by just how Christ-like he was in that initial conversation. That it really made me want to trust him, because it seemed that he really did have my best interests in heart, that he really cared about my soul. Especially the fact that he just didn't jump into, "Hey, why are you here?" And we met the second week, and it was still primarily me talking, but I could tell that there was something he wasn't saying. So at the end of the conversation, I asked him, "Okay, why am I wrong?" Which I almost instantly regretted asking, because he started talking. And I have no idea what he said whatsoever. I could not for the life of me tell you what he said, because the moment he started talking, I just sort of heard ringing. I realized, oh, okay, he doesn't agree with me. But since he had been so sincere in that first conversation, and in the second one as well, and even in that one, he said, "I will be glad to continue having conversations with you about this," gave me pause and made me want to at least consider what he had said. It was around that same time that I stopped taking hormones.
The sincerity and kindness of this priest is a good model for Christian accompaniment, with the caveat that it is important to carefully discern the best way to approach disagreement. That said, Sean was serious about his interest in Catholicism. As he learned more about the Catholic vision of the human person, he was inspired to pause his hormone treatments.
I had been on them for about 1.5 years at that point, and I had started to learn some about sort of Catholic teachings on theology of the body. And I had been really wrestling with questions of whether it was morally illicit to take hormones at that time anyways, because it was in a certain way denying my bodily integrity, I guess you would say. I don't think I had the words for it at that time, but I was definitely wrestling with it regardless. And so I had read about the meaning of the body, about the reasons why we say, when we talk about maleness and femaleness the way that we do, well, the reason we call God Father. I just remember being really inspired by that in a lot of ways, that the idea that my body actually has a meaning and a purpose and an inherent goodness to it beyond just its sort of function as something that allows me to do things. And also, I am a father, and that is something that I've always really loved, the fact that my son is the only person who can call me father. we've had a lot of hard times over the years for various reasons. And in a lot of ways, that taught me about our Father's love for us, because I got to sort of see firsthand how he responds when his children don't love him, which is, just true. I mean, we don't trust our Father. And yeah, I've gotten to see what that's like. And it also gotten to experience loving the way that he does. That sort of unconditional love that says, I don't care what you do to me, I'm always going to be here for you. So I ended up deciding to detransition, and that was while I was in RCIA.
RCIA, now known as OCIA, is the process of initiation into the Catholic Church. And as a fellow convert, I know that entering the church isn't the culmination of one's conversion, but just the beginning. It's one milestone on a gradual, lifelong process of being loved and transformed by God.
He's taught me a lot over the past 6 years since I became Catholic. It's just been this incredible journey of him continuing to reveal who he wants me to be, how he wants me to be. While there were aspects of my personality that I was actually finding in my transition, that there were parts of myself that I had been denying sort of my entire life, about my love for beauty, about my sort of empathy and compassion, and my desire to be loved by Jesus as his bride. And I've learned a lot about myself, about my masculinity in the past 6 years as well. That when I was transitioning, there were aspects of my masculinity that I was simply denying. There were still also elements of myself that in transitioning I was denying, about fatherhood and laying down my life for those, who I love, and sacrifice. I will say I am much more integrated than I was a few years ago. After I detransitioned, I went through this long period where I was trying to live as a man the way that I had been living as a man prior to my transition. And that was just very deadening in a lot of ways, because I was just going through the motions and going to work and being overly intellectual, man who works in an software engineering firm, and coming home and lying on the couch and watching TV because I just felt dead in a lot of ways. And so I remember having a conversation with my counselor about it. He's always been very good at asking the hard questions, and so he's very big on internal family systems.
After hearing Sean's story, I wanted to know more about internal family systems, or IFS. So I reached out to a Catholic psychologist who specializes in IFS to share about what makes it a distinctive approach.
Hello, I'm Dr. Greg Bottaro. I'm the founder and director of the Catholic Psych Institute. I'm a Catholic clinical psychologist, and our mission is to integrate the faith with the psychological sciences.
So assume zero familiarity with this. So what is IFS? First of all, the first part of the question, and then how can this particular model be helpful for those who are wrestling with gender?
Sure. So real basic history. There was a marriage and family therapist named Richard Schwartz who understood family systems. Family systems is a way to approach family therapy in which you see every member of the family in the therapy room as good, as valuable, as having an important voice, and you work through conflict between these various members of the family by giving everybody a voice, recognizing the inherent dignity of every person, and saying that there are communication difficulties that we can work through if everybody follows certain rules, gives everybody a chance to speak. And sometimes you have some real disastrous family situations. You have somebody's an alcoholic, somebody's abusive, creating all sorts of problems. The simple answer would be, well, let's kick them out. This person shouldn't be in our family. But that's not the proper approach to family therapy necessarily. So we say like, well, maybe there's something underneath that alcoholism. Maybe there's some other pain, some other trauma that particular person is bringing into the system that we will get much further by working on that person's deeper issue. So this particular family therapist was working with an individual from a family system, and the client had an eating disorder, and by doing the family system work, they resolved a lot of the eating disorder, but then she had a lot of self-hatred, and then she was cutting. And he was sitting with her one day in individual therapy, and he sort of gave up. He hit a wall. He was so frustrated. He couldn't get her to stop cutting. And he just threw his hands up in the air. He sort of out of frustration said, well, it just sounds like part of you just really wants to hurt yourself. And then all of a sudden she said, yes, you're right. There's part of me that wants to hurt myself. And then he was really sort of surprised by the answer. And long story short, realized that if he approached her with the same family systems mentality, but as if that family system was inside of her, that she had different parts, different members of her own self, that there was one part of her that was violent and aggressive and originating that sense of cutting, and then another part of her didn't want to do it, was coming to therapy in the first place because she realized that this was harmful and bad and didn't want to keep doing this. And then another part was scared to say what it really felt. And another part was kind of happy that she was cutting herself because it was getting back at her family. And even though she didn't want to hurt herself, she didn't really feel resolved about the issue that brought them to family therapy in the first place. And all of a sudden he saw this whole nother system emerge within the person. So this is why this is called internal family systems.
So internal family systems is an integrative model of therapy, where the therapist uses the metaphor of a family with conflicting personalities and desires to understand the conflicting motivations and impulses within a person. The goal is to better understand the complexity of what's going on in a person's interior life in order to move from inner conflict and fragmentation to a greater sense of wholeness and integration.
We all can relate to having these various dimensions of our personality. So we say, I'm not acting like myself today. I woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Or I'm just hangry. I need to eat something. My blood sugar must be low. I'm not acting like I normally act. We divide ourselves up, and then we sort of validate one way of acting, but then we invalidate all these other things as if they're not really us. Well, turns out those other parts are just as much us as the way we would like to think we act normally. So this approach, by seeing us having this internal system, opens the door, and this is what I do in my work, is integrate our Catholic faith and philosophy to a much deeper compassion and receptivity of God's mercy. And this is something I think especially people in the church struggle a lot with, is we believe in divine mercy. We know that God's compassion is supposed to be everything, and God loves first, and we're supposed to respond to love, and it's all about love. And yet, we hate parts of ourselves, and we're supposed to be following Christ, who is leading the way of love. And when he reaches out to anyone that he encounters in the gospel, he's loving the person where they are in their totality. But we don't do that to ourselves. So that's a little bit of a basis of what internal family systems is, and then that's how we can start to look at it from a Catholic perspective and now move towards a deeper sense of understanding of what we're really called to.
While IFS is a therapeutic model, it also represents what might be for each of us a healthier spiritual disposition. To not react to our more seemingly unintelligible impulses with immediate critique and dismissal, but to first seek understanding. And by allowing ourselves to really understand why we act the way we act, it gives us a chance to bring ourselves before God and allow Him to truly see and heal us.
I think in general, the parts work model is really helpful because, again, we are so stuck in this mono-self assumption that if something enters into our psyche that goes against what we believe ourselves to be, we reject it. And that creates a lot of real problems. And so the tension and the conflict that it exists within us internally is because we're not loving ourselves enough. It's because we're not accepting the different dimensions of what is actually in our personality. So apply that now to people who have these different fears or thoughts or sense experiences of gender. If we could just start with compassion, it's like part of me feels like I'm in the wrong body. I bet there's a reason why that makes sense if we listen. You know, part of me feels like I'm a woman, not a man. Part of me feels like I'm a man, not a woman. Like, let's talk about that. Well, let's like really explore why part of you feels like that. And if we go deep into that, it does make sense. And then especially if we understand developmental psychology and we realize that there were significant developmental milestones where a person is validated in that dimension of either masculinity or femininity, and then they move on to the next milestone. And if that's not validated, you get stuck there. It's coming from this very deep psychological need. So my approach is, that's really important if you have that psychological need. Nobody wants to have this kind of discordance and internal conflict. So it's not just an argument to have to disprove. It's a very, very deep need that needs to be validated.
So how would you respond to the perspective that because we have these parts, then, you know, let's say I'm speaking as a male person, there is a part of me that's a woman, and I'm going to identify as that part, like that's real, right? So, right. I mean, is there a danger in this, like shifting the ground of what it means to be a man or a woman to the psyche?
I think that's where this is the both and. I mean, it is important to really understand that a feminine quality is not the same thing as being a female. And there is a deep connection between, and that's why we need a gender revolution, is because we need to understand that in our biological realities of male and female, we have the capacity for characteristics of the other. We need to actually like open the doors wide open to that reality and all look for that within ourselves. And then it makes sense of it for everybody who's experiencing those characteristics. So that man that shows up that says, I have this feminine part of me, it's like, of course you do. Mm. So do I. It doesn't make you not a man. Mm-hmm. It makes you a human. And it means that you're actually growing in your humanity, that you're even acknowledging and growing in that dimension of who you are.
Now that we have a sense of IFS, I want to pick up Sean's story again and how this therapeutic approach shaped his own journey with gender.
And so I remember when I very initially detransitioned, I went to him because he was a Catholic psychologist. I wanted to make sure that I was meeting with someone who wouldn't be trying to sort of like sway me back into something that wasn't going to be good for me. One of the very first times I met with him, one of the questions he asked me was, what do you like about your body? And I remember being so caught off guard by that question. And so I sat there for like 5 minutes and I eventually said like my eyes, but that was all that I could come up with. And so he asked the follow-up question, what do you want to like about your body? which is this really interesting exploratory question of sort of acknowledging that, like, okay, you're not where you quote unquote should be, but it's not putting that judgment of should. And so it's just acknowledging that to be healthy, there are improvements that you want. So what are those improvements? Without sort of being paternalistic and sort of insisting, hey, this is what you need. So we explored that for a while, but then I remember it was a couple years down the road and I was really sort of struggling still with all the things that I felt like I had left behind when I detransitioned. And so he said, well, what are the things that you loved about Sarah? That was the name that I went by at the time. What were the things that you loved about Sarah? Getting past the sort of more superficial things like clothing and makeup and whatnot. And so I said, well, I loved the fact that as Sarah, I could sit down with someone and just empathize with them, and that I wasn't focused on myself. I was looking out at the other person and just loving them. I will say, like, I still kind of miss the hormones aspects of it anyways, because estrogen is really strong and it affects your emotional range substantially. And I do sometimes miss having that emotional range. But yes, and so we talked about the things that, like, as Sarah, I felt like I could more easily embrace or live out. And so he asked the question, what prevents you from being able to do that as you are now? And I couldn't really answer that exactly. And so we started trying to figure out how to go back to Sarah and pull things forward that could come forward, and could they come forward without baggage coming along for the ride? It was this process of, like, untangling. I will say in terms of, like, personality, I've embraced a lot of my personality that I lived out then. I'm not integrated yet. I'm not a saint yet. I think, one of the things that I've noticed is that the days that I am most empathetic, where I'm sitting with another person and just listening to them and just receiving them, those are the days that I then sort of experience a large disconnect from masculinity. And I typically have dreams afterwards where I'm Sarah.
I don't really have a question about this, but I'm glad. I appreciate how honest you are about how hard detransition was, right? Because sometimes I think the stories are framed so simplistically, like conversion stories can be framed simplistically. It's like, I was in the darkness, now I saw the light, right? But that you actually had to go through a grieving process. And and even just coming off the hormones sounds really intense. It's important to note that since Sean came into the church and since he detransitioned, his experience of gender discordance has not simply vanished. Rather, what has changed is that he now makes sense of his experience through the integrating, loving gaze of Christ. When I first spoke with Sean, which was before our official interview, he said something that has stuck with me. He described how his experience of gender discordance has become a means of sanctification for him. He told me, "This is how I'm getting to heaven." I asked him to share more about that in our interview. His experiences as a father, particularly the love he has for his son, have played a key role in understanding his own identity before God. At one point you said something like, "This is how I'm getting to heaven." And I wonder if you could say something more about that idea, because again, that seems like a totally different way of framing it than most people would think about it.
I think it's the case for all of us, right? So, like, our crosses are not just this heavy weight that's supposed to, like, hurt. God isn't out for just making us suffer meaninglessly. He permits our crosses out of love, and he intentionally places these crosses in our lives to purify us, to grow us, to challenge us, and to help us become who he has designed us to be. I know in my case, I've learned a lot through all the trials. I was talking about the situation with my son. There was a 5.5 year span he wasn't sleeping at my house. And there was a 2 or 3 year span where he didn't tell me that he loved me. Like I say, that taught me a lot about simply being patient, about setting my own desires, my own needs aside for his sake, about how to just love without looking for what you're going to get back in return. And also to look to God for sustaining me in that, as opposed to sort of earthly rewards. Same thing with my gender disconnect. One of the things that I've thought a lot about is the idea of what our lives are going to be like in eternity, when we're resurrected and we have our glorified bodies. And one of the things that I've tried to sort of keep in mind is like living now the way that it will be. So even though like I have this disconnect from my body, or at least at times I feel disconnected from aspects of my body. First of all, that's unique to people who experience gender dysphoria. I know a lot of people who like don't like parts of their body. There's a particular way that's lived out in my life, but it's also relatable to a lot of people. Through suffering, we learn how to better understand and relate to other people's sufferings. Some of us suffer more than others, but suffering is an invitation to be united to Christ and his passion. Like I said, we can't get closer to Christ than suffering. In a lot of ways. Well, suffering properly embraced. Suffering in and of itself is awful, but when we bring it to our Lord, he transforms it into love, and it's beautiful what he can do with it. I haven't necessarily always seen what he does with it, but I try to trust anyways. Yeah, so I try to live now the way that I will relate to my body in eternity.
Back to my interview with Greg Bottaro. Okay, so I kind of want to turn now more toward the question of how to accompany someone who is experiencing gender distress. And here, obviously you're a clinician, but even just thinking more broadly, so just speaking to people in the church, they might have a family member, a friend, someone in their parish. Like, what does it look like to walk with someone who, maybe does think that because this part of them has, feminine qualities, that really is who they are, right? So how do you walk with someone who's kind of embraced that idea?
Well, I think it's really important for people to understand that it's like when your identity is in such conflict, the only thing you can feel is how isolated you are. And if you're in a position to accompany somebody who's going through something like that, the number one most important thing is relationship, is connection, is to really be with. And stepping into that world and just being with somebody, first of all, it's very difficult and it takes real love, but it is the most important thing. And so it's not about how you say a certain thing, how you argue a certain point, whether you're condoning or not condoning a certain behavior. It's really just a matter of taking a risk and having courage to really be with somebody and see them for who they are. The number one principle is humility. It's always going to be more complex than our pride wants to make it. And if we can hold to a humble disposition of curiosity, exploring, seeking, understanding, then we're not going to go wrong. And then number two, it's never okay to disparage or to act against the truth and teachings of the church, of course. So, I think a lot of people get into dangerous territory because of compassion, because of empathy, because they're walking with people. And then it's like, well, maybe you should, play this out and see where it goes. And you're giving verbal permission to do things that we know are actually really unhealthy. So we want to be very careful how deep we're going. Our model that we use when we're walking with people is we always say we want to have 1 foot on the shore and 1 foot in the water where somebody is drowning. It's not either or. And if you have 2 feet on the shore, you're never going to actually be able to help somebody. And if you have both feet in the water, you're going to drown as well. So it's very difficult. And that's where the discernment comes in but the principle is always the same. So you always have to be thinking, what foot is on the shore, what foot is in the water, and how am I having 1 foot in each place?
I wanted to ask Sean this question too. What do you wish your fellow Catholics better understood about people who experience gender disconnect? Or I guess, how can the church do better? I don't know if you have any kind of practical reflections on that question.
Yeah, okay, so I have a couple. So the first one is that not every person who experiences a gender disconnect is out to fight a culture war. But at the same time, they're almost sort of victims of the fact that the church is fighting this culture war. I'm not saying that the church shouldn't be trying to correct the culture. They certainly should. But it gets very difficult to understand as a person sitting in the pews that when the church is talking about gender ideology or talking about transgenderism, that they're not talking about the people because they barely ever mention the people. I sort of bristle every time in a homily I hear a priest talking about the isms, in large part because of how rarely I hear them mentioning the people who actually experience gender disconnect. I don't know. I sure would love to hear that just spoken openly, that God loves me. I know that. I certainly know that. But I've also been working very hard at my faith life for 10 years. So for those people who are struggling, if they only hear priests talking about the isms, but they don't talk about the people who are actually impacted by those things, then what are the people going to think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's also kind of the implication there that, well, no one here is struggling with it, right? It's all out there in the culture. Yeah.
I also think that it's so difficult, right? Because the moment you bring up, hey, let's nuance this, then people start worrying about, oh, you're going to soften the teaching. And I think it's difficult because to nuance anything requires a time investment. So don't try to correct someone unless you're willing to invest the time in actually walking with them. It's that sense of don't just give someone a cross and say, hey, okay, start walking. Walk with them. Show them that you actually love them and are invested in their lives and are willing to sacrifice with them. For that matter, demonstrate with your life that you are sacrificing already. Because if you're just saying these things, but it's not evident that you're actually living it out in your own life, then you're being a hypocrite. Show them with everything that you have that they matter to you and that be Christ to them, right? And we say that a lot, being Christ to someone, but what does it mean to be Christ to someone is pouring yourself out for them. Building and also being willing to stand up for them. If someone else is saying, oh no, sorry, hey, ma'am, you can't come in here because XYZ, then go outside with them and say, hey, I'm sorry that we couldn't do this. Hey, let's go somewhere else. I'm going to go with you. at my son's school, so he just finished 7th grade, and they were talking about theology of the body for middle schoolers, and they were going to be splitting up the boys and the girls. They were going to be talking with the boys about boy things, talk with the girls about girl things. And for the girls, they were going to be like making these little pink hearts and then write on the pink hearts like all the attributes of a future husband that they would love. And I sort of balked at that a little bit, and I kind of afterwards like tapped the sister on the shoulder and asked her, hey, so what are you going to do for those girls who don't like boys or don't think that they like boys? Or for that matter, for those girls who don't like pink? I just think that when we approach these things, we need to keep in mind that there are a variety of experiences, and there are ways to live out the Catholic faith that don't simply fit into this, okay, you're either going to end up married by 20, or you're going to enter religious life. There's a lot of other ways to be a saint. And if someone doesn't fit those two molds, that doesn't mean that they're defective.
The call to accompany someone is always a call to conform our lives to Christ, who greets every person with open arms and pierced hands, ready to enter into the depths of their existence alongside them. And he does this as the incarnation of truth and love. Yet we too often fall into the trap of thinking of truth and love as separate entities, with truth being like the terms of a contract we make with God, and love as this positive emotion we feel towards someone else. In Christ, however, we find the unity and fullness of both. He reveals, both in his teaching and his actions, the merciful, life-giving nature of God. And note, too, that he didn't reveal this all at once to his disciples, but step by step along the way. How can we incarnate the unity of truth and love in our lives? How can we learn to see with the integrative, merciful, loving gaze of Christ, who gathers up all fragments and divisions, heals them, and makes them whole?
We talk about, speaking truth with love. And I think the question that needs to be asked is, which truth are you telling that person in that moment? If you're focused exclusively on telling them the truth of their sexuality, okay, maybe there's a point in which that needs to happen, but maybe the truth that they need to hear is that they've been loved since before time existed, that there's a God who is willing to make himself vulnerable and cold for them.
When you feel weighed down by the world, and when you feel ostracized, and when you feel pushed away from everyone you know, the one who knows you the best, the one who loves you the most, to know that you can go to him and that you're never going to be turned away, that you're never going to be cast aside, that he's always going to receive you with love and mercy, I can imagine that's got to be one of the greatest consolations for anyone, but especially someone with this experience where they feel really different and separated from everyone else. I can imagine that would be such a safe haven.
There's a person who can relate to everything that they've ever experienced, that there's a God who is willing to be abandoned so that he could show them that them being alone doesn't mean that they aren't important. Which truth are we telling the person? And which truth do they need to hear in this moment?
From the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, you're listening to the Gender Accompaniment Project. This series is written and hosted by me, Abigail Favali. Today's episode was co-written with Corinne Starsinik. Our producers are Nick and Corinne Starsinik, and our executive producer is Noah Braden. Special thanks to Greg Bottaro, Sister Maria Gemma, and Sean for being part of today's episode. Thanks for listening.